let me explain. Giving a toy sword to a 5-year-old in the middle of a restaurant filled with people is probably not the most responsible decision to make. But I had a plan. I can remember sitting down at the dinner table in a Lebanese restaurant, having dinner with my family and some family friends. And I had brought with me 2 toy swords that I used to love to play with. And I wanted to give them to Junior. But before handing them to him, I wanted him to appreciate the value of those swords and what they meant to me. I said, Junior, come here. I want to tell you something. These are very powerful swords. And before you play with them, I want you to repeat after me. With great power comes great responsibility. And he seemed to take those words so seriously. And they apparently made such an impression on him that 2 months later, when we saw the parents again, they mentioned that whenever Junior would play with those swords, he would always say, with great power comes great responsibility. And I remember playing with those swords, that feeling of power as I would slay and attack and defeat my enemies at the point of my sword. But isn't that a feeling we all crave to some extent? That feeling of power, of control over something we cannot control. Wouldn't we just love it sometimes to have a parent or our boss or that coworker at the other end of that sword? But Jesus takes our hand and says, no. Power is not about the self. It is about others. In Matthew chapter 20, we come to an argument. In verse 24, it reads, when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the 2 brothers. Now, what on earth could have possibly made the disciples of Jesus argue amongst each other? Was it a Pharisee exploiting a beggar in the street? Not this time. Was it a person defaming the name of Jesus? No, not this time. They weren't indignant at that. Was it a Roman, worst of all, a Roman Gentile defaming the name of Yahweh? Not even that. The disciples were indignant at each other because someone else was trying to get first in line, to get that spot next to Jesus. In the preceding passage, 2 brothers, 2 disciples of Jesus, come before him with their mother, asking that they be given a seat at his right hand and at his left hand when he enters his kingdom. That is, when he establishes God's rule on earth. And when the rest of the 10 disciples hear about this, they're jealous because they want those positions of authority also. And so Jesus, when he responds to this situation, corrects the way they thought power was exercised in the kingdom of God. And most importantly, he shows that the victory of God, the demonstration of God's power, was achieved through service. And this was part of the radical message that so challenged the society of his day and continues to challenge our society today. In verse 25, listen to this. He says, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Jesus was correcting the way the disciples thought that power was exercised in the kingdom. Because the disciples would have looked to the past, and they would have remembered Jewish history, which was filled with Gentiles and other peoples coming and subjugating God's people. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Romans. And the disciples would have looked to the past, remembered King David throwing off the yoke of the Philistines. And they would have looked to the present, and they would have seen those Roman battle standards marching through the valleys of Israel, conquering with the sword. And it was in this context that the disciples of Jesus would have expected him to establish the rule of God on earth, conquering through military and with the sword. But Jesus' response to this, listen to what he says in verse 26, saying, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first must be your slave. Jesus is taking what were considered the two lowest positions in society at the time, the slave and the servant, and he elevates them, showing that what makes a person great in the kingdom of heaven is service and humility. And Jesus is introducing a revolutionary concept of what it means to be in power and to rule. And he's showing a higher way, a better way, that does not lead to destruction, but a way that restores the hurting, that lifts up the oppressed, all by putting the needs of others before the self. And this is what so scandalized the society of the time, that power and the kingdom would not be established by the sword, not through lust for power or glory as the disciples conceived it to be, not by the Caesars or by the generals of this world, but by his servants in the world, by the peacemakers, by the merciful, by the meek. But Jesus doesn't stop there. Listen, in verse 28, he says, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Jesus is taking this wonderful, glorious image of the Son of Man from Daniel chapter 7. The Son of Man entering the throne room of God the Father, the Ancient of Days. And in the same sentence, he takes the image of defeat, of ransom, of sacrifice. And he brings these two seemingly polar opposites together, showing that the Son of Man was also the suffering servant. And it is through the selfless act of that suffering servant that the victory of God, that the triumph of good over evil that God promised so long ago to his oppressed peoples, that would occur through service, by putting the needs of others before the self. Isn't this great, this image of a powerful, redeeming Savior, one we can rejoice in, that we can be happy in? But isn't that realization where Satan wants us to stop? Wouldn't it be so easy if someone asks us about Christianity, or asks us, what does it mean to follow Jesus? Wouldn't it be so easy to just point with our words? But that isn't all of Jesus' plans. He wants us to imitate him, because in imitating him, we can be Jesus to others. And we can show them the love of Christ, because Christ does not want us to just point to him with our words, but point to him with our life. So that is the call of Christ to his followers, to serve others, putting the needs of others before the self, to serve in love, to help and visit the sick neighbor in the hospital, to partake in that homeless shelter project at the local church, to serve at that food drive at the local community center. Our neighbors, our family, our teachers, the people we go to school with, the people we see on the other side of the grocery aisle. Our community can be transformed by God through the transformative power that Christ works through us. This is that vision of the kingdom of heaven that is in the world, but not of it. And that is part of our responsibility today, to pass on that message of love, that powerful message of love, both in thought and in deed. And I would challenge you today, I would exhort you to go out and to pass it on.
Any of you guys ever passed a message in church? I mean, be honest. At one time or another, either you or somebody you know has needed to communicate something very badly to someone, but in the middle of a service. Be it, I need a piece of gum, or do you have any pins? Could be, I forgot my Bible. What about this one? Have you heard this one before? The guy farthest right in a row or in a pew turns to his left and says, hey, Cracker Barrel after church. Pass it on. And the next guy gets it. Cracker Barrel after church. Pass it on. Got it. Say it with me. Last guy. Cracker Barrel after church. Pass it on. And it goes all the way down the line, and if things have been done properly, everybody's going to end up at Cracker Barrel. But if Tim, that guy on the end, ends up in Bob Evans, something went wrong. And you got to think, passing a message about where you're going to eat after service is pretty easy, right? But even that can get messed up. You know, there's one message in particular that we really cannot mess up. That's the story of God's love, the gospel. In Ephesians chapter 2, verses 4 through 5, Paul kind of gives us a little bit of a rundown on this thing. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. So, what if you got the chance to tell somebody about the gospel, but you only had this much time to do it? In 3, 2, 1, go. What do you say? It's a complicated question. How do you shorten all that down, the gospel? Well, first, I think the appropriate question should be, what is the gospel exactly? And then after that, I'd say the logical place to start is at the beginning. So let's start there. Let's start at the birth of Jesus. Because this is important. Because this is really different from up there. Now, what I mean by that is, it takes a big leap to go from heaven to hay. 24/7 God presence with farm animals. See, that's the gospel. But that's not it. Don't just run out and say, I got it, I've got the gospel, I know it. Because it's not just that. It wasn't just God coming down here and letting himself become nothing. Because Jesus was also a servant. You see, while Jesus was here, he was serving people. He was out on the streets, healing people of their diseases. He was causing the deaf to hear, the blind to see, the mute to talk, the crippled to walk, and he was raising people from the dead. Like Ben was talking about, he didn't come into this world to keep things the same. He didn't come into the world to keep the status quo. Okay, servants, serve me. He didn't come to keep things that way. He said, I'm going to take that idea that you guys hold so dear and think is so concrete, and I'm going to do this. Let's see what happens. You see, Jesus was a servant who washed the feet of the people who would inevitably abandon and betray him. That's service. You see, that's the gospel, but that's not it either. That's not just it. You see, the gospel isn't just about Jesus, the helpless baby coming to this earth, and it's not just about Jesus, the servant, because there was also Jesus, the sacrifice. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when the Romans come with swords and spears to arrest Jesus, like Jesus is going to break into a bar brawl, his disciples rush to his aid, and Peter draws his sword. And Jesus has to push them all back and say, stop. Don't you guys understand that if I wanted to, right now, I could call down an army of angels and stop this whole thing? So, why didn't he do that? What kept Jesus from doing that? Easier than a cell phone call. It's, hey, Dad, you know that army you have in your closet? Can you just bust them out here right now? Call in the reinforcements. I need the cavalry, Dad. Boom. But he didn't. So why didn't he? The answer is Jesus' love for humanity. Only Jesus' love for us made him voluntarily let those Romans arrest him. Only Jesus' love for us is the reason why he let them torture him, mock him. Only Jesus' love for us would lead someone to go on a cross, the death penalty of the most hated people in society, deserving of the most brutal death. And I don't know where I heard this, but somebody once said they studied the geography of Jerusalem, and Golgotha is in a certain place where if you go in, you're going to see the crosses. For maybe the younger people in the audience, if you've seen Pirates of the Caribbean, when Jack is sailing into the island for the first time, they have all those skeletons out in the bay that says, this is what happens to pirates if you come here. That was it. Jesus was also an example, like they were putting down some rebel. So it wasn't just a death, it was a humiliating death. Why? Jesus' love for us. I mean, that's powerful. Only Jesus' love for us would be why he absorbed all the sins, shame, and suffering all at once and said, it's finished. You see, that's the gospel. But hold on, I'm not done yet. The story of God's love, the gospel, wasn't just about Jesus in the manger. It wasn't just about Jesus washing the feet of people he knew would leave him. It wasn't just about Jesus the sacrifice, because there was also Jesus the death defier. Amen. You see, on the third day, Jesus was making a statement to us today, saying, don't forget this. I am the boss over death. He said, let me show you something. I'm gonna just watch me, okay? I'm gonna die, I'm gonna wait 3 days, and then I'm gonna show you who's boss. When he got up from that grave, he put death in its place. He sent death to the corner and said, you stay there. And at the end of all things, once I'm done with all this other stuff, I'm cleaning out that corner. And you won't have anywhere to go. That's the story of God's love. That's the gospel. But hold on, because I'm not done yet. And neither is God. You see, the story of God's love, the gospel, wasn't just about a helpless baby. It wasn't just about a servant leader who turned the ideals of the world on their head. It wasn't just about somebody dying a criminal's death who didn't deserve it. It wasn't just about somebody raising to life again. This was no accident. You see, back in Jesus' day, unless Jesus interfered, when people died, they had this tendency to stay dead. So Jesus decides, I'm going to break the rules. But then the story of God's love isn't done yet, because God says, now that you have this, don't sit on your hands. He said, I sent Jesus for a reason, and Jesus told his disciples after he was resurrected, go tell people about this. Be Jesus to others. You see, the story of God's love is awesome because God includes us in the love story. We get to be a part of it. Now back to that pesky question. If you got the chance to tell somebody about the gospel, but you only have this much time, 3, 2, 1, boom, what do you say? I'd like to suggest Jesus lived, he served, he died, and he rose. Don't forget that. And he rose because he loves you. That is the story of God's love. That's the gospel. And last but not least, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the last next-gen speaker, Jake Brown.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all so much. But that just wasn't really strong. I know that you all probably didn't get to go to Cracker Barrel this morning because it's so early before the first session. But I'm going to come up again. Can we try that again, please? I need to see that.
Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, last but not least, please give a thunderous round of applause for Jake Brown!
That's all I needed. I'm done. Thank you all. I appreciate it. No, not necessarily, but isn't that what we all crave and long for? That from other people. I mean, think about it. Think about how we wouldn't it be just great if every time we walked into the office at work, someone, yeah, there he is, yeah, or when you came home and your family was like actually excited to see you, yay, hey, you know, or you go in a restaurant, everyone's like, hey, there she is, yeah, we crave that. We want that, and there's a word for that. It's glory. It's something that we all share. And think about, I mean, we try and find it in achievement. You can think about the person who wants to be the next MVP on the team, or win the promotion at work, or be the next presidential candidate, or even the one who wants to make straight A's. All these people have a desire for in their lives, a craving for glory. The Apostle Paul was human, like us, and had it too. But his understanding of what glory is much different than ours is today. To see that, we look at 1 Corinthians 15, verse 9, where Paul says, I am the least of the apostles, and I don't even deserve to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church of God. Whoa, wait a minute, Paul. That is not the kind of stuff that gets you the applause, right? Let's rethink your introduction, Paul. Let's say Paul, apostle of Jesus Christ, wrote 13 books of the Bible, planted 14 churches, traveled some 10,000 miles preaching the gospel. That's who I am. Yeah, there you go, Paul. Isn't that the glorious stuff? That deserves the applause that we all long for. And Paul responds to that idea in verse 10, where he says, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace was not given me without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Paul understood that it's not the things that we do on this earth that bring from our Father in heaven, but the very truth that we need him and rely on his grace, not on ourselves. That's where comes in. Paul also understood that without a feeling, without an acknowledgement of our guilt before God, it's really hard to see the need for grace. I mean, think about the hour you first believed. How precious did that grace appear? That grace wouldn't have been so sweet, so precious, had you not understood the wretched state that you were in apart from Christ. I mean, do you remember what that state feels like? Some of you do. Others of you may not. If I can be completely honest with you for a moment, I remember that state very well. Before I was a Christian, I was very lonely. I felt unloved. I felt like nobody understood me nor cared to understand. And that led to depression. And depression led to despair. And to be transparent with you all, that despair led to the place, the moment that was kneeling at my bedside with my grandpa's pistol to my head, ready to end my own life at 15 years old. I felt the weight of guilt and the pressure of being unloved. And I made a decision in that moment. I got up and I went outside, and holding the gun in one hand and the phone in the other, I called the youth pastor at a church in town. We'll say his name is Ryan. And Ryan helps me understand something that no one else up to that point in my life can help me understand. That despite my despair, God's grace is enough, and God really does care. See, without that feeling of shame, that grace wouldn't have been so precious. But when I understood God's love for me, despite the state that I was in, I was able to pray on that day, years ago, for the first time at 15, like I even believed that God cared to listen. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. And it's the same for all of us. Grace seems so much sweeter after those moments in our lives that we go through where there is such pain and despair. Grace is so much more precious. I can think of a Sunday that I was in church, and it had been a great Sunday. For those of you in ministry, you know, you nail it. And it's during the invitation, Kim, that Ryan, the same youth pastor that had led me to Christ and baptized me and was now mentoring me for a year, starts walking up front. And I'm excited. I mean, I'm already ready to give him the applause, because Ryan is one of those people that, hey, he speaks and everyone wants to listen. He always has something good to share. He speaks to you and he encourages you. So I was excited, and we all sit down as he gets up and he says, I'm stepping down from the youth ministry position of this church because I've gotten a young lady pregnant out of wedlock. And I was crushed. I felt the weight of it. I felt the weight of sin and shame, the absence of glory and grace. Haven't we all been there? That moment that we feel like, God's done. This one's too big. This sin has gone too far. This is one too many times, and God's grace does not reach that far. He's done. He's gone. He's absent. But if you were to catch up with Ryan today, you would see how he himself has embraced God's grace, been restored to youth ministry, taking care of his daughter, mother, baptizing, teaching, and mentoring more students than he ever did before. That is one of these moments that God brings about for his glory and not ours. It's not in Ryan's own courage or strength that he mustered that power to make a difference in his life. It was only God, and so God brings the applause to himself by giving grace, should we choose to accept it. But for many of us, that moment, the breakthrough, doesn't always come quickly. No, if we can be honest with ourselves, sometimes it becomes really hard, extremely difficult to embrace God's grace. Why? Because we're still stuck in sin, because we're still slaves to addictions, because we still battle bitterness, and because people do things to us that just break us down and break our hearts. And God's grace and God's presence in those moments seems so far gone from where we're at. So how do we live then in those moments? Those moments where God just seems to be done. 3 weeks ago, I was supposed to go to vacation for spring break, but my grandmother was in a horrific car accident, which took me home instead. And I was sitting in the intensive care unit hospital room with her one evening. And I was holding her frail, bruised, broken hands. And I felt her pain. And it was dark. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. And the only light in the room was from that screen that shows all those squiggly lines. And you don't know what they mean. You just hope that they keep squiggling. And as long as no alarm goes off, everything must be at least stable for now. But any moment it could happen. And I feel her pain, and I'm asking the same question that she is. Where is God? Where is God in that moment in the intensive care unit? Why does the woman who's so faithful have to feel so removed from God's grace and experience such pain? And I resolved to know something that night, that even though I didn't experience, even though I didn't feel God's presence, he was there. He was right on the other side of the bed, in that empty chair, holding her other hand and feeling her pain. Now, the struggle's still not over. There's a long road to recovery. But sometimes in the midst of our struggles, God gives us grace.
That's right.
To have faith that he's not done. That yes, the situation is full of despair and maybe some hopelessness. But what God does is he gives us the grace to believe that even though he seems so absent, and even though the situation seems way too much for him to handle, he never leaves us. He never abandons us. He's always with us. Ephesians 2:8-9 says it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and it's not of yourselves. It's a gift of God. That he gives us that strength, and we don't have the strength to muster on our own. Not by works so that no one can boast. That's why Paul doesn't start with, I did this, planted 13 churches. And he doesn't start with that. He starts with his brokenness, because it's in the midst of the weakness that God is there.